Hi everyone, and welcome back to the studio. So as you can tell from the title of this video specifically, this is for weaving and bordering any granny square blankets you do. Even if it's not a blanket, if you're weaving and bordering granny squares together and giving it a border, this will help you. And there is like a part 2 to this. It's all one video, but there is separated it into part 1 and part 2, just because this granny square, the circle one, you weave it together slightly different than you would with the sunburst granny square. It's a very slight difference. It's just where you put the hook into the corners, like what corner spaces you put the hook into, but other than that, it's all the same. Let's get started with this. I am on the last row for this blanket with weaving together this way, and then I will show you how to weave together this way. And when I'm weaving together, I personally like to do the longer side first, so the larger amount of granny squares. So this is a 6 granny square long by 5 granny square wide blanket, and in this case I did weave the 6 granny squares together for the long ways, and then I will be doing the wide next because that'll be shorter and a little bit quicker to do. And for the weaving together, at least for this way, I'm using this Loops and Threads. I think it's like Soft Classic. I don't think it was chenille, but I think it was Soft Classic or chenille. I'm blanking on the color name, but this is the one I'm using. I'm going to be using the lavender for the other way, but this is what I'm using to weave together. And you will need your hook. And you will need your hook. I'm using the same one that I did to make the granny squares. You'll need your yarn to weave the granny squares together, whether it's the same yarn you use for the granny squares or a different one. I'm using a different yarn just because this yarn is multicolored, and I just wanted to be able to have some semblance of like an actual border, like differentiation between the different squares without the lines changing color. And then you'll also need scissors. You don't necessarily need a stitch marker or a threading needle for this quite yet. You won't need one until the border. So just have the threading needle and the stitch marker available. Like I believe I've said, I just stick my stitch marker on my scissors. So, and then I keep my threading needle in the little sleeve for the scissors. Again, just to keep it all together. Okay. Okay, so for this, what you want to do is just get not a whole lot, but get quite a bit of yarn off of your skein, hank, ball, cake. And then you're just going to kind of line it up with the side of your granny squares. And if you're doing the first row, you're going to essentially set it up like this. That'll be how it looks. And you do want the yarn you're weaving together with to be underneath the 2 squares. So we're going to start off with a slip stitch, and you want to leave a long tail. It doesn't have to be super long, but you do want a decent amount of tail. So we're going to do a slip stitch. Okay. And then again, you want your working yarn. Sorry if there's a lot of shaking going on. I'm still getting used to recording while weaving together. So for the circle, granny square blanket, or if you're using these granny squares, since there's only a chain 2, you're going to put the hook into the chain that's closest to the side you're working on. So you're going to put it in this one. If I were working on this side, I would put it in this one. But since there is no like middle chain, you're just going to put it into one of the sides. And again, it's going to be in the chain that's closest to the side that you're working on. Make sure you're not working on your tail. And again, same thing, closest to the side you're working on. Pull up a loop. And then you're just going to you're going into the back loops only of the stitches. The back loops only of the stitches. And if you remember from either of the tutorials, I left these tail yarns just out because, again, I found when weaving them together, if I had pre-cut those tail ends already, it became easier for the corners to undo themselves. And I am trying to keep this as unedited as, I am trying to keep this as unedited as possible. So I'm sorry for any shaking. If I have to like sigh occasionally, I apologize for any of that. I will come back once I get a little bit closer to this stitch to show you how to take care of the tail. Okay, so I'm basically one stitch away, so just to show you again, back loop only. It's a little bit harder to see with that, but back loop only. Okay, and then you're going to go over that tail. If it's sticking out a little bit, you're going to go over, move it behind your hook, back loop only of the stitch to your side. And again, just try to keep it back. Move up to your next stitch. Next stitch. And then as we get to the corner, we're going to do this. Okay, so we're in that first chain 1, not the second one, we're in that first chain 1 of the corner. And then now, since we've done that, we're going to bring our second square down. And again, just kind of repeat what we did. So we're going into that second chain that's closest to the side that you're working on. And since you're weaving these two sides together, you're going to choose the chain that's closest to this side. So again, this is the chain closest to that side. And then you continue as normal. So I'm going to come back and meet you all once I get to the end, the very last square, to show you how to finish off the weaving of the rows. And again, this will apply to any rows you weave together when you're doing that initial weaving together. And I will show you in the next part of this, the next section, how to weave these sides together once you've already woven together one way. I'm going to show you how to weave together the other way. I'm only going to do one row just because sake of time and to keep the video on the short side. Okay, just really quickly, sometimes what you might need to do while weaving together, I'm not really going to show it because it will look different for everyone and it might not happen with everyone. But something you might need to do when weaving your squares together is sometimes it can be a little bit off kilter So you might need to like put two hooks, so you might need to put your hook through two loops on this side and one loop on this side. You might need to put your hook through one loop on this side and two loops on this side, just depending on how wonky it is. And sometimes it's hard to tell until you're closer to the end, and it can be a little bit awkward doing that at the end, but do not worry if that is the case. And just like I said, you might just need to adjust with two loops on this side, one loop on this side, or one loop on this side and two loops on this side, like I said. Don't worry if that's the case, it happens. So the only reason why I thought of it is because it just happened to me right here. So it's not a big deal if it does happen. Also, something I realized a little too late after weaving these two together, is that I had flipped the square around. Usually this corner would be over here and already in that end already woven in, but I'm just gonna take care of that once I weave these sides together. And if that happens, I usually like having all the corners kind of in the same orientation, just so I know I took care of it. But you don't have to do that. You can just orient it however you want, depending on the blanket and the colors. And you can just take care of these whenever you get to them. I just like keeping it, like I said, I just like keeping it oriented in the same way, so I can know that I took care of that. But just a situation where right now it is what it is, like this. Okay, so I'm about to weave together the last granny square for weaving this way together, last one for this round. So I thought I'd show you a little bit more, one more time, what to do. So again, the chain that's closest, sometimes it can be a little bit fiddly. Just try to be patient with yourself while doing this. And then it's going to be this one. And then you just continue as normal. And even if you were starting like with the first two rows, it's the same process, weaving together the first two rows. I know I said that this was the last two rows being woven together, the last row being woven on, but it's literally the same process, quite literally the same process. Let me pull it a little bit closer. And again, you're doing it into the back loops only of the stitches. I know the white looks very bright in comparison to the other colors, even in comparison to this pink. So I apologize if that bothers your eyes a little bit. And sometimes this does happen where you pull up some of the loop or part of the yarn from the loop of what you're weaving together. And if you're making these blankets to sell, or if you're making something to sell, try to avoid that. But if you're making it for yourself or a close friend who won't mind, then it's not the end of the world if that does happen. But just remember to take it slowly. And then the last stitch to do, I'm going to leave my hook in there, and this is where your scissors come into play. You do want to do a long tail, but you don't want to do it super long because you don't want to waste yarn. Because, okay, this one was very long, but a lot of that time, this excess tail yarn, and then you're going to do like another slip stitch style tug, and then that is it. But what I was saying is that this is probably just going to get tied up and woven in and cut anyway, so you don't want to do too much, but you want to do enough that it won't come undone. Okay, so now I'm going to start weaving together this way, and this is essentially the same process as weaving together this way. This part can be a little bit different. It doesn't have to be, but it can be a little bit different. So I'm going to show you how I wrote it out in the pattern, how to do that. But you do not have to do it that way if you do not want to, but I do recommend that way. So just to show you with like this first square how to do it. And then other than that, other than the slight change of what to do here, it's the same thing as what we did this way. And you're just going to repeat that and then do this little step and continue as normal. I am using this lavender color to just like offset the pink and also tie in the fact that there's also purple in this. So where is Pink Fuzz? Just trying to find the tail. There it is. Okay, so again, the other thing with this yarn is it can start coming undone. So it is most likely the chenille yarn, but you can continue working as normal. I'm going to set the ball aside. And kind of like what we did for the pink, you want the yarn you're working with underneath the squirt. You want the yarn you're working with underneath the squares that you're weaving together. And that's just because it'll help it look a little bit neater. It'll be easier in the long run and that's just because it'll be easier on you. It'll look neater in the long run. So when you do have that little bit of like it coming off, just give yourself a little bit of extra wiggle room with that, and it'll usually be like the initial part of it. But again, we start off with a slip stitch, and you do it into the chain stitch that is closest to the side you're working on. And with going this way, it might be a little bit easier to have, like you see what I'm doing with my hands, hold up your working yarn with your pinky and your ring finger, or one or the other. It doesn't have to be both, but one, the other, both, or at least holding it with one of your fingers and then pulling, because it is getting held down by the weight of the squares. And you also don't want to. It's not that you'll lose it necessarily, but it can be kind of hard to retrieve it. So, okay, so for this, I'm only going to show how to do the first square and then going into the second square. Just because, like I said, it is pretty much the same except for that one little step at the part where this is woven together. And then I will show you what to do for weaving together the sunburst granny squares. And another little note, once you get to like this point, when you are getting close to that line, it might be easier to start holding the yarn after that line. You might need to like move and adjust your hands as needed. Okay. And then what you'll also want to do is just kind of straighten it out, because when you're doing this, it will bunch up a little bit. Straighten it out, just make sure it's all looking okay and looking the way that you like it, and that this is still pretty much evened out. Well, maybe not so much. This is 2, this is 3, so I will need to go into 2 on this side. And then 1 on this side. Okay, oop. Okay. And then once it gets close to that line, it does start getting a little bit tricky. But I do kind of like going really close to the line when I'm weaving together. It can be a little bit tricky, and this part isn't necessary. Going really close to that line isn't necessary, but it is something that I personally like doing. And then what you're going to do is chain 1 over. You're essentially chaining 1 over this line. Now you do not have to chain 1. You can just immediately go into the next step of going into that stitch, going into that stitch, and then continue on as normal. But I just find, for me at least, when I'm doing this, it is a little bit more evened out if I do have that chain 1 over this row. And then you continue as normal, and if you do the chain 1, if you don't do the chain 1, that is perfectly fine. And then you just do what you did for these rows, and then creating slip stitches at the ends. So I will see you in the next part in like a second for how to do the sunburst granny squares. But again, it's essentially the same thing as this, except where you put the hook into the chain. Excuse Hilda in the background if you can hear it. That seems to be my crocheting, weaving granny square blanket together background noise. In this part of the video, I'm going to show you how to weave together the sunburst granny squares, and then I'll show you how to border your blanket. There are multiple ways to border your blanket. I'm going to show you the way I'll do it for this blanket, but again, there's no single way, and I'll explain the other variations you can do for bordering your blanket. But let's start off with weaving together. As you can see, I already did this side, and I'm using white because this is my Christmas blanket, as you can tell from the colors. And the white is just there to kind of offset the red and the green, even though it is like... So like with the circle granny squares, you're going to do a slip stitch. And then this is where it's different. It's pretty much the same as weaving together the circle granny squares, but in the corner you do start somewhere different for the sunburst granny squares, since there is a chain of 3 to finish off the corner to make the corner part. You're going to put it into the middle stitch, so 1, 2, 3. I'm going to put it into the side of that middle stitch. And then put it into, and then again put it into the side of that second stitch. So 1, 2, 3. So this one, put it into the side. And then it's yarn over, and then pull through all the loops. So again, put it into the side or the bottom half, the bottom loop of the stitch. And then go to the other square, bottom half, bottom side of bottom loop of the stitch. Pull through all 3 loops. And then you just keep going from there. And you want to go into the bottom half, the bottom loop of your stitches when you're weaving them together. Something else I wanted to mention was when you're initially weaving together the rows first in the one way, with each row you add on, you want to make sure you have the correct number of squares available, accessible, so you can just grab it off the pile and add when you're ready to add another square. So in this case for me, this blanket, the rows that I'm weaving together each have 12 squares. So each little pile that I have has 12 squares. This is the first one. This pile has 11 more. Also, something that I didn't mention, but when you're getting to the top, again, you want to go to that middle stitch in the chain on each side, and then you move on to the next square, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. And for this blanket, it may not seem like there's a pattern to this, but there is a pattern. You can kind of start to see it now, but once this blanket is done and bordered, I will show you what the pattern looks like in a more wide pan view. Okay, so we're getting close, so I'm just gonna show you again, but with these ones, what to do, especially with that little tail that we left uncut.
So, are you sure you have the exact right place?
And again, I just leave the tail uncut just to make sure that the corner doesn't come undone. And move the tail to the back. And just keep going until I get to that middle chain of the corner.
So why haven't they come?
The details were set a very, very long time ago.
So just one more. And then I'm going to move on to the next square. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, so I wanted to show you real quick. It's the same as with the circle granny squares, but I just wanted to show again with these ones because the corner part is just slightly different. So like with usual, you go up the corner and then you go into that middle stitch, that middle chain stitch. So this is the first one. This is the first one. And then the second one is right here. Sometimes it is a little bit hard to tell, but and then grabbing the scissors, doing a quick little cut. Oop. And then I'm going to do another slip stitch to kind of tighten it up, pull, and then we're done with weaving together the 2 rows. And you're just going to repeat that for however many other rows that you have. And then like with the circle granny squares, you're going to weave together the other sides until you're all done. And again, I'll show you how to do the other sides for these ones specifically, but it's the same thing as going up and also pretty similar to the circle granny squares. Okay, so I just wanted to share real quick that this is roughly how it will look. So it's the scarlet red, Kelly green, claret red, succulent, and then this will repeat onto this row, and then for the rows underneath it, it just alternates like that. And again, with future rows, it'll alternate similarly to how this looks. And then there's all this up there, and this is just a repetition of what's going on up here as well. So I just wanted to share that that is the rough look, and just 3 more sections like this. So this is how it's looking so far. I have 2 more rows to add before it's done and before I can start working on this way. Okay, so something I recommend, it's not really important or necessary to do it this way, but a tip I recommend is whatever is like the longer side, because sometimes you can have the width longer than the length. Whichever one has more granny squares, like this way for me, going down this way for me was 12 squares versus 8 squares. So I did the longer one first, 12 squares. I did that first. And then that way, doing the second part going that way is going to be quicker because I already did the 12. So if your length is maybe 3 squares and then your width is 4 squares, do the 4 squares and then do the 3 squares. Or if it's 9 by 10, do the rows of 10 before doing the rows of 9. So again, you can see here I did the rows of 12 first before doing the rows of 8. So I'm now working on the rows of 8. Okay, so for going this way, it's essentially the same way as we did this way, where you start off with a slip stitch, go into, let me show here, go into that middle stitch of the corner, go into the middle stitch of this corner, and then just go up. And once you hit that middle part right there, you're going to do, like with the pink blanket, you're going to do a stitch over this to continue. I'll show you how to do it once I get up here. Okay, so a couple of notes is usually with that, if I'm making this for myself or my family like I am for this blanket, usually I don't worry too much about that. And that's just because when I was pulling it up, some of the red yarn came through with it. And again, if I was making it to sell or for someone else, I would make sure that that wasn't there. But to continue with this, usually I hold the working yarn once I get to about like a fourth of the way through the square, so like around anywhere between here and the halfway point. And again, we're doing back loops only. And like I was saying, this usually happens when not all of the yarn comes off the hook, and so it gets pulled up. And you can avoid that happening by just going a little bit slower, not going as quickly, making sure you get all of the yarn off the hook when you're pulling the working yarn through and pulling the hook through. Just making sure all of the yarn comes off before you go into the next loop. So just to show you how to do this next part, okay, this one's a little bit off kilter, so I am going through 2 of the greens and then only 1 of the reds to even it up. And then, like with the pink blanket, we're doing 1 stitch over this woven together part, and then you're going to continue as normal. Okay, sorry for any shakiness. This is as unedited as possible. As I said, you're going to continue as normal, go into the closest stitch to this row, and then just keep going. And it can be a little bit fiddly at the beginning because, you know, you are close to this part, but just take it slow and don't rush through anything. Okay, so I'm now going to start making the border for this blanket, and it is going to be in the same weight that I used to weave the squares together. Now, if you're doing one single color for your blanket, this is a Christmas blanket, so I'm trying to have it somewhat Christmassy. But if you're doing a solid color for the blanket, then you can just match the color you're weaving together to the color that you use for the granny squares. It doesn't have to be different. It's just whatever is easiest for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a slip stitch, take it out, take out the hook, but leave it there. And something that I have done, that I've learned, is when I am doing a border for a blanket, I have the bottom side, so the side with all of the woven in the ends. That side is facing upwards, so this side is technically the bottom, so it would face downwards when I'm using it, but I have it facing upwards, just because, you know, when you're crocheting, you have the right side facing you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the first corner, and this can be any of the corners. Insert the hook, put the loop back over, tighten it back on, pull it through the corner, and then I am just going to chain 2, because actually, sorry, I'm going to chain 3, and I'm doing double crochet stitches, double crochet stitches, just because I feel like that looks a little bit better, but you can do treble stitches. The smallest stitch that I would recommend doing for your border is a half double crochet, and for that you would chain 2 and then start doing half double crochets. And for double crochet and half double crochet, you'll do 2 of them, chain 2, and then do 2 more, so either 2 double crochets or 2 half double crochets. You can do something similar with treble crochets and half treble crochets. You would do chain 4, you would do chain 3 for a half double crochet, chain 4 for a treble crochet. I don't know what I just said, but chain 3 for a half treble crochet, chain 4 for a treble crochet, then do 3 of those, chain 3, and then do 3 more, and then continue as you would using whatever stitch you're using into the side. And again, I'm just doing double crochet because I feel like it looks nicer and has that kind of look I would like for this. And I'm going to go around twice. I'm going to go around the blanket twice. Now what I am doing, I will show you in a minute, is I'm going into the tops of the stitches, the loops of the stitches of the granny square. Now this part, when you're getting to a space between here and then here, it can get a little bit tricky, but just again try to get into the loop. And this can be applied to either blanket, whether you're doing it with the circle granny squares or these starburst granny squares, sunburst, starburst. Your border, the way you do your border, can be applied to either way, which is why I didn't explain it the first time around. crochet here. Again, this is where it can get kind of tricky. Okay. Oh, I did 2 in that one, which I don't necessarily need. At this point, I'm just going to go into the back loop only and not the full stitch. Just because I've noticed that if I go into the space, then it just looks a little bit wonky. But if it's easier for you to go into that space, then go for it. And that's just for any stitches that are getting close to here. That are getting close to where the 2 squares are joined together. And then something else that I do as well is, excuse my butt. And then something else that I do as well, excuse my bunny in the background, is the loop that this is coming out of. I put my hook in there. It can get a little tricky. And then I do another stitch into that loop, and I just find that that kind of evens things out and makes it look nicer. And I continue as usual, and again, any stitches that are close to where the 2 squares are joined, I do into the back loop only. But again, do whatever is easiest for you. Okay, and at this point, I can go into the full stitch. Yeah. Let me show you the progress. You can kind of see already, like here, here, and here, how it's like, how the stitches don't really fully even out, the white ones. And that is perfectly fine. If I'd gone fully into this space, it would have looked longer. And then this way you have some sort of like even line. Mostly even line. And I'm going to go just all the way down the side, and when I get to the next corner, I'm going to do 2 double crochets, chain 2, 2 double crochets. If you're doing half double crochets, it's the same thing. If you're doing half treble or treble crochets, it would be 3, chain 3, do 3 more. And then for getting to this final corner, you just deal with it with the way that you would deal with a granny square, where you just weave it in and then cut the working yarn, and then weave in that tail yarn. And you can just cut, if you haven't already, you can cut the tail yarns from your granny squares and trim off any excess. I don't think I can find any of that excess stuff up here. So because I didn't cut that tail yarn when I wove the granny squares together, a lot of it, there's quite a bit of it poking out in the side. So if you have any of that, go ahead and trim that off as well. You can do a second round for the border. And again, that's kind of similar to the granny square, where you would do slip stitch into this space, slip stitch into this space, and then do the chain 2, 3, or 4, depending on the stitch you're doing, and then go around like usual. And one final note, I alluded to this before, you can see it pretty well here, let's see if it focuses, is that when you're getting to like the stitches in these spaces, between like the set of 3 and the set of 3, you want to do it in through the stitch only, through this part, and there is like the back loop of the back post of the stitch. You want to do it above that. Okay, you can see it a little bit better with the hook in there, but you want to make sure you're getting underneath the loops of the stitch and above that back post. So for the sake of keeping this video on the short side, I did explain that, and I'm not going to show that because it is very much similar to the way you do the granny squares and just stuff I've already shown before. Again, I apologize for my bunny fussing in the background. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.